Without further ado, I'd like for us to start our conversation.
So this work's titled Inheritance, and as you brought up, Jeffrey, I do have a show in Milan now that is a kind of continuation of this body of work. But the slides that I prepared for today are from 2021, and it's different works from an exhibition called Fault Line. I'll show an image of that exhibition at some point, but I decided to focus on that not only because this work deals directly with inheritance, as is this work is titled, but also it's kind of the, let's say, the start of me coalescing these ideas that we've discussed in depth in our studio visits that we've had throughout the years. So I thought it was a good body of work to focus on, even though the kind of research has continued. For this work, I really love talking about the materials that come together in it, because I feel like what's important to me about this work is the materials and the way they stack up on top of each other. And in some ways, it's hard for me to unpack it more thoroughly than that. For this work, I created a lost wax unique cast of my hand in crystal glass. And by that I mean it was a one-time use mold, so it wasn't able to be reproduced more times. And then it's on top of a stone that I gathered from posts in Arizona, where my father and his family were interned during World War II. And then the ring on the hand is an heirloom from my grandmother. So for me, the material list is lost wax, crystal cast, post in stone, and grandmother's heirloom. And for me, as I was making this work, I was on one hand starting to learn stone carving and wanting to work with geology and thinking about not only it as a, in terms of geological time and a material of the earth, but also thinking about a kind of like psychological implication of working with geology, thinking about things that I've inherited, thinking about wanting to materialize things from my family's past that have no material. And that was sort of the question for me: how do you materialize something that has no material? I thought a lot about intuition, instinct, and emotion as ways to sort of sort through this. But in the end, as I brought together these first two elements of the work, I just happened to be moving and discovered all of my grandmother's heirlooms and thought, oh, that's a really accessible component I can add to the work that I feel anybody can relate to. So while you have something that's like very personal to my mortal body, you also have something rooted in history, in American history during World War II, and also my family's history. And then you have something that I feel like anybody can sort of relate to in the heirloom. If you move to the next slide, it's another variation. It's a different heirloom from my grandmother, but you can see another configuration. I've made maybe 4 of these works. You can go to the next one. And this is an image of the installation Fault Line. For this exhibition, I also included some bronze casts of tree branches. These were actually the first, let's say, subjects that I was researching that started off this body of work. I had been told by my friend David Horvitz, whose family was also interned, that at a lot of these sites that are still remaining from the internment camps, that many of them were barren when they were erected. That was one of the reasons why the camps were erected there, was because of their barrenness. And a lot of Japanese Americans at the time were farmers. So when they were brought there, they were able to cultivate the land quite a bit. And a lot of the trees that are still standing to this day are left over from this time. In terms of posts in Arizona, I've been able to find evidence of the land before the barracks were built, or right when they were built, actually. And then images from my own family's archives of the barracks, midway through the internment. And you can see quite a bit of not only landscaping was done, but there were also images I found of bountiful harvests. So when I went back to the site at some point during the pandemic, I actually found some fallen tree branches on the ground, and I actually took them and cast them in bronze and called them witness, to talk about them as standing witnesses from my father's time there and then my time returning to the site. When you think about, geological time, you can sort of imagine that the time that my father was there and the time that I revisited were like a second apart or like a split second apart. So for me, these branches represent that duration of time. You can also see here some of my early stone carving works, as well as how the work Inheritance was originally displayed. And then I'll just say also in terms of the display of this exhibition, I was trying to find a way to ground the different works in the exhibition, but not create a kind of visual hierarchy to people who came to visit the show. And I really wanted to sink viewers in the earth to really give them the sense of groundedness. So I developed these rammed earth pedestals to kind of create this spacing so as people walked in between the pedestals, they felt sort of sunken in the earth. You could go to the next slide. And then we also talked about including this other body of work that I guess in some ways kind of bridges from that show into the show that I have now that I included no slides of. But this work is called Heirloom, and I think it, while the work I just showed you has like a very personal resonance for me, this work sort of thinks about a different kind of inheritance, let's say, through craft, which is also a big part of my practice. I've made different works in the past that have their own, let's say, topics that they focus on, but they also utilize different kinds of traditions and different kinds of craft histories. I do a lot of glass blowing, so I've borrowed a lot from the studio art glass movement as well as Murano traditions to create my works. So you can say there's sort of like layered messages happening, not only in the way the work's formalized, but also in the way somebody can identify the different techniques being used and misused in some cases. And this work I started with a crocheted blanket that I saw that, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a blanket like this, but to me, having a kind of crocheted blanket is something many people have experienced in their home, and they kind of like end up with it, and they're kind of like, I don't know why I have this thing, but I just like have it. And this technique, I could talk a lot about how I, developed the method for creating this. But in essence, I had to basically knit a few of the flowers individually and then cast them in bronze individually. So what you have here is not only a marriage of this like, what's the right word? This knitting craft or this like kind of tradition of knitting blankets that get handed down. But then it's been re-embraced in the bronze fabrication as well, because each of the flowers were cast individually and then knitted back together through being individually welded back together. So I really love this idea that that kind of like what could be seen as industrial method, this like craft or this handmade craft tradition of it's kind of being brought back into the creation of the work. And of course, there's this like negative space of a form under it, which to me, I think again, really speaks to the way I'm trying to use materials to talk about things that are immaterial or are no longer materialized with us today. So that's like a short overview, which I could elaborate on later in a variety of directions. But
that's great.
Yeah, I think this is the last slide, right?
Yeah, I think
Perfect.
so.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
perfect. Thank you. Here, I'll pull up Jeffrey's slides here.
Oh, please.
Jeffrey, just let me know when I should
Oh,
move between them.
okay, thanks, David. Well, these are some newer works of mine from the last couple of years, and these works are from a project that is called To the Satisfaction of the Botanist, and these are installation shots from an exhibition that I had at Erlich Steinberg Gallery here in Los Angeles, and Ace is here in the back, and so I'm happy to have him here as well. And fascinatingly, one of the plants that's that rings the sculpture that you were just showing, heirloom, from what I can tell, is a Vinca minor, which is the plant. It's a near relative to the plant that this caterpillar is eating, and and this caterpillar is eating it because it's a poisonous plant from the Apocynaceae, or the dogbane family of plants, which it learned if it could metabolize over a period of 1 million or so years, made it more or less inedible to predators. So kingfisher birds and various other lizards that would eat it decided that it wasn't very appetizing when they saw what happened to their friends and family over the centuries trying to digest them. And this project is it's, for me, very new in that it's an attempt to account for some personal experiences that I had. This near relative of the Vinca minor is a plant called the Vinca cataranthus, which is the main ingredient of the oldest and most successful chemotherapy plant. And I very nearly died of the disease of cancer in the 1990s. And this plant was the one that I was infused with. And so I've been trying to account for internal changes that did to me. I mean, I had profound side effects, and then psychic effects that came from those physical ones or that happened alongside those, many of which were hallucinations that didn't stop for a very long time. And it turns out, doing some research, it was a very common hallucination to hallucinate caterpillars, small green, brightly colored insects. So I've been trying to deal with that. I don't know if it's exactly an inheritance, but it's very strange at the level of coincidence. And here too, there's a question of inheritance and debt, because this plant is endemic to the island nation of Madagascar, and its therapeutic effects were discovered under the colonial endeavor. So this is a medicine that's extracted from Ombiasi, medicine men from the island, and used differently, appropriated and industrialized, essentially. In 1991, which is when this picture is set, which is also when I had chemotherapy, the bubonic plague, the medieval, easily treatable plague, was ravaging the island. So as a way of thinking about justice or injustice, or the consequences of a kind of bioprospecting, or therapies derived from traditional practices, that seems to be something to consider and to think about. And I guess we could look at the next image. That's a close-up of the silver print. These are from an animation that I've been working on the last couple of years. So there's a kind of comical moment where the insect turns its false head, its mimetic eyes at the camera, and kind of looks back, which is what they do when they're afraid. They pull this kind of mimetic mask over their face to look intimidating. But I think because of cartoons and animations, it just looks really sweet to human eyes. And I'm interested in that. And then this is a kind of a display that I made of sapphire glass and a glass loop and 2 gelatin silver negatives of the plant itself from clippings in the Natural History Museum, Paris. And they're negatives, so if contact printed, they would make a less Gothic looking image and more illustrational image. But I suppose in some ways it's great to see them up against Kelly's work, because this relationship to the index and what that might constitute, the trace of some direct past, and what that might portend for us as contemporary viewers. There's maybe, I mean, those modes of working were in disrepute for so long. I mean, really the time of our entire education, it seemed, a kind of blithe postmodernist calling into question of what it would mean for it to be your hand. No, really your hand. Your grandmother's ring. I swear it's really her ring. These conversations wouldn't have been quite as possible. They would have been presumed either to be fictions or ruses or something like that. I'm also, I think, maybe because of my age, even more apprehensive about it. So it's that's an interesting space to try to occupy for me. But that's the bit that I have to show. Those are my slides. Thanks.
And I think I'll leave it on there, and this will probably go dark at some point. And then, David, if you want to talk.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to pick up on the concept of heritage in response to the prompt of the panel, which, as in the introduction stated, I wrote a book called Heritage and Debt about art and globalization, where heritage is often thought of as kind of English country houses, a kind of, reactionary form of commodified culture and history. But what I tried to do in this book is to think about heritage as any form of cultural inheritance at all, and to think about what its value was within the global circulation of art. So one thing that I wanted to mention, it was interesting because Jeffrey has been thinking about Ernst Bloch recently too, who wrote a German philosopher of the 30s and later, who wrote a very interesting book called Heritage of Our Times, where he talks about different modalities, different temporalities within the present that can be reactivated. And particularly this was in the shadow of fascism when he was writing, and perhaps relevant for us today, that certain kinds of forms of nativism or what would seem like reactionary tradition can actually be activated for both leftist and right populist effects. So in a way, we shouldn't. One of the things that's very moving about Bloch's book is that he argues that the communists at that point in the 30s shouldn't have abdicated forms of spirituality, mysticism, etc., to the Nazis. And so it feels like kind of a lesson at the moment. But when I wrote this book, I was thinking about how global contemporary art activates forms of heritage outside the West to make works seem distinctive and contemporary within a Western global art market. So in that context, heritage was a kind of value that was present outside the West. But what's important is that within postmodernism in the US and Europe, the return to a kind of historical or heritage-oriented montage in the 1980s and onward, usually the global moment is dated from the late 80s or so onward, that it was happening in the West as well. So I don't think that the activation of heritage should be understood as something that is about the global South. It also is very much a technique and a strategy for Western art, or however you want to call it, Euro-American art, etc. So with that in mind, with that kind of tool in mind, I wanted to think about David's show, which I didn't see in advance, but thought about from images in advance, and seeing it today has confirmed this. The first thing that's really important to say is that this show is developed around, in a sense, what you could call a dispossession of heritage, a photograph of his grandparents' wedding as two Pakistani students in Michigan being taken and put into the newspaper. So to some degree, what could have been, and David writes about this in his statement, what could have been a family photograph was in fact a news photograph. And so, as I think probably most of us in the room are aware, the dispossession of cultural heritage from Native American cultural heritage to really many different kinds, where certain markers of history or identity are appropriated by others, is a rampant strategy as well. And it goes back to this idea that heritage has value of different kinds. But this show, in a way, takes up this question of what we could say a kind of distanced heritage, or finding your heritage as separated from you. I mean, in a way, it's kind of like the way you were describing finding your grandmother's, the heirlooms as almost something that you came upon afterwards. But in this case, David came upon it in the paper. So it's an accidental or public archive. And what interests me about this is that there are strategies, formal and conceptual strategies in the exhibition that respond to this idea of a kind of public or accidental archive, in the sense that there's a way in which what we see in this sculpture behind me is the overlooked, the furniture that's behind the bodies that would have been in the photograph. So there's both the pulling forward of the overlooked and the inscription of the invisible in this act of dispossession of heritage, if one buys that. I mean, you may tell me that that's not how you think about it at all. But what's interesting is that this poetry, let's say, this poetics of the overlooked and invisible, is associated both through the gold form and in the title to wedding jewelry, gold wedding jewelry, which would have been a feature of what was being photographed in the picture, but of course was black and white. So Twin Study, the work over here that is probably not visible to most of you, but is a montage of two articles. One, the one where the photograph was taken from the Ann Arbor paper, but the photograph is absent. And what's interesting here is it's a kind of whirlpool of text in which the image is the sort of vanishing point. And Bloch, again, I've sort of got Bloch on the mind, but one of the ways that he understands the capacity to activate heritage in the present is through montage. So through a distancing, in a way, a distancing that reactivates and reframes the mode of heritage. And so the use of montage here, I think, is particularly interesting, and also this kind of circular whirlpool effect is also really interesting. So I just want to say a word or two about the third component of the show. I'm not talking about the chair, which I would put into the overlooked category because it's in the photograph, but someone's sitting on it, right? The red drawings, the globe heads, in a sense, what they do is they, as I understand it, that reproduces the scene, this one, right? And it uses a vocabulary that David's used for quite some time now, I think, of these characters with the globe head. They're almost like cartoons, but they're also, they universalize. I mean, the globe is a universalizing trope, right? A universalizing image. And so in some ways, I think of it as the return of everything that has been distanced in the rest of the show. This idea of the overlooked, the invisible, the montage which points to the the absent vanishing point, surges forth again as this kind of globe. That's all I'll say, because I think there's a lot of mystery in how these parts come together, and I think it would be wrong to try to make some kind of tie it up too neatly. Maybe I've done that already too much, but it's a professional, problem.
Thank you. That's great. I think that's a really good place to take it and relate to some of those points. And I think some of those relate to some of the things I wanted to say. And I decided that I thought the best way to kind of talk here would sort of read a few quotes that I had written to myself several years ago, sort of early in the development of this work, and that kind of speak to some of the families of ideas I was thinking about then, and that I think are in kind of context of what we've been talking about already. And as we go to questions and stuff, it could spin out, because I have been thinking about sort of these questions about heritability, about archives, about what is near and what is far in a lot of different ways, and some that are a little bit more esoteric. But I think these quotes will be maybe more grounding and allow for a conversation that is where we're all on the same page. So this first one comes from David Graeber book. In particular, comes from chapter 6, which is called Games of Sex and Death. And Graeber writes, "To make something saleable in a human economy, one must first rip it from its context." And I guess I should say a little bit about what he means by a human economy. A human economy, he's kind of creating this term to distinguish a kind of economy that it would once have been called a primitive economy, in which sort of objects of trade are exchanged around kind of social effects. And he's trying to say that it's not really fair to call it a primitive version of a monetary economy, which is often how it was historicized. And in a human economy, the things that are being rearranged are relationships between people. And I'll just read that quote again, I really like it. To make something saleable in a human economy, one must first rip it from its context. And then the second quote, I guess this one's not quite as tight a quote, but it's sort of something I wrote to myself and comes out of conventional narratives of economics. That's sort of the kind of thing you'd see in the first pages of an economics textbook. That's like a really normative, here's your econ class sort of book. And this narrative that I was kind of making a note about is that the idea that capitalism or trade replaced and improved on exploitative and extractive forms of wealth accumulation, bringing agency out from the hands of hereditary princes. The idea that what is somehow just about capitalism and what makes it an improvement is that it takes it out of the hands of hereditary princes. And I think just that phrase, hereditary princes, thinking about the thing that was so unfair, that's the kind of boogeyman that's set up as the straw man that capitalism solves, is this idea of something being passed down in that way. And then I guess sort of related to the second, something I was thinking about, which is, I guess, risk, and the idea that in order to assess risk, there needs to be a sense of time and a sort of a sense of connectedness of the present to the past, like heritage, might strengthen a sense of control over the future, which is what is necessary for managing risk. And so I guess this one's almost a question, I would say, that asks us all to think about whether there is a connection between heredity and risk. And I think I'll leave it there, because I think we've talked quite a bit, and just move into the questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks everyone for your presentation and your work and ideas. The first question I have, I want to go back to this thought that Professor Joselit raised in relationship to distancing effects and maybe also omissions or gaps, the space between bodies, references, generations. In some sense, the moment of resistance at the core of an inheritance. This, maybe we could call it the encounter of non-transmission or non-straightforward transmission of the past into the present, because in the philosophical mechanism of Bloch, we have this, the metaphor of montage is very valuable there. In your work, there's a number of physical gaps that constitute the moment of what, in a more manifestly identitarian practice, would be about a singular person or a singular couple and their names, and they would be epidermalized at the level of their cultural constructs. That would be the main part of the significance. I think as well in the work that you showed, Kelly, and I could be wrong, but it does seem that there's this moment of extreme specificity, but then an overlapping, a stacking of these different generations, different materials, and different working methods. And so I guess the first question is really just about how does this moment of non-identity or non-transmission, this space between these elements, forms, generations, bodies, etc., become a place of opportunity in your work, a place that's generative for you. And it does seem to be generative precisely along the lines of an idea of inheritance. It's paradoxically the means through which we could start to talk about what a heirloom is, what an inheritance is, or in the case of this entire show, I mean, I'm biased, I've looked at it a lot, it does seem to be the way pastness comes to us is through these gaps and these various holes. I don't know if Kelly, if it's unfair to say all that and then ask you to respond, but...
No, I can respond. I mean, for me, when you talk about the specificity of some of the research I've done as it relates to my personal family history and myself, I think on one hand, I've always wanted to talk about that, not because I specifically want to focus on like one particular historical moment or something particular that has to do with a way I want to think about what I've inherited as an individual, but to really connect with other people about things that are unknown in their own families. Like for me, this was a very specific event that's also an historical event that I can talk about. But for me, I'm always trying to talk about how I haven't met a single person that hasn't had something in their family history that they don't know something about. And the project's more about me trying to materialize that in order to talk to other people about kind of what do you do. And I love that you're talking about the gap, because to me it's kind of like, what is this? Like you find something and you're like, well, what do I do with this now? Or what is this? Or how do I make sense of it? Because it's not really about making sense, but it's about reaching some kind of, and that's why I say materiality, like materializing it somehow for ourselves. And I love that you're talking about montage. I've been thinking about montage since I don't work in film. I sometimes look to other mediums to help me understand my own work better. And I've often thought about the way my materials come being together as a kind of montage. So that was like really amazing to hear you talk about that from your own research and writing. But yeah, I feel like it's very accurate because so much of it for me is about the unknown. And maybe to like further this, as I was working on my project about Post in Arizona, I came across Karen Higa's writings, who's somebody I never knew personally, but whose writing and whose research has made a profound impact on me after she passed. So I've actually looked to her writings and found some text she wrote where she talks about going to the internment camps with her father as a child and seeking to understand her relationship to these sites separately, which was an amazing dovetail to reach, after I'd already been committed to this research and done my own visits to the site. And in it, I'm not going to read the quote, but in it she talks about looking to the land and trying to find the truth of this history and shards of institutional pottery and fragments of pieces left behind, and really finding it in that search and in that kind of detritus, like in between the gaps.
There we have a literal image, an earthbound image of a hole or a gap, a fault line through which the past is emerging, as if through that crack itself there's something that can radiate back from the past to us, or that which has been buried or submerged. David, what about you? You thinking about gaps and negativity, elisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely I knew I wanted to focus on the couch rather than the people in the sculpture. That it's the kind of thing where I was reading things, thinking about things, some of these quotes that I read, I had already made that drawing, which came out really out of a feeling. It came out of like missing my grandmother, Googling her, and then being really surprised that there were many more images than I thought of a completely strange disposition. Like, what are these photos? Like, why they exist? And then feeling a lot of like I was sort of in that place, but also had no access to it at the same time. And it felt like focusing on the element that was the thing that was supporting them might speak to that feeling more than focusing on the people, although the drawing process is a little different. And I don't know, in terms of, I guess, montage, or in terms of thinking about moving between different things in your work, and just going back to what you were saying, I guess, about, I don't know, this being like the real heirloom. I feel like the way the three specific elements of that piece work, it really lets someone who doesn't have the personal relationship to your grandmother imaginatively have that, and it is really powerful to encounter something that feels like it speaks to something distant and powerful, and then also be aware that like that distance is unbridgeable at the same time, or like the object, it's just a thing. And I think the difference in the materials do that in that work for me, and the analogies between them, but how they also visually rhyme in different ways. And I guess for me here, like somehow like doing it in the drawings, but then also the later sculptures that have these kind of drawn-like qualities, and they are also paper, but it's just a very different thing. It felt like doing it in different ways might, I don't know, conjure that place in a different way, or and I don't know if that's exactly a montage, but it is something about one thing next to another that's different, and then moving back and forth between them. I did really like what you said about distance and then the kind of closeness in the drawing.
Professor Joselit, could you tell us a little? What's also helping me not say David to two people facing exactly the same way. So David J. Professor Joselit.
Old David.
All the Davids in the room, I asked this question. Can you help us to think a little bit more about this theory of inheritance or heritage that has more to do with montage and less to do with what you had a great phrase about a conservative definition, something like a English country house, or this. In some ways, we know montage was leveraged as a way of rethinking against reification and against these various ossified forms of doing historical work. Maybe if you could just speak a little bit more about where you see possibility there right now.
Yeah, I mean, this will be maybe a sideways answer, but I think it's helpful to comment on what's on the table, Kelly's and your and David's work. So I think, I would call your work, it's an assemblage, I guess you could say. But what really interests me about it, one of the many things, is that each of the materials, which you discussed as quite different, not only has a kind of life history, as it were, but also a different temporality. So there's like the geological, the igneous, if you want to call glass, that, I don't know, you're a glass person. And then there's the human life. And that to me is very beautiful, the way the materialities each have a temporality. And then I was thinking about where you, Jeffrey and David, are both like extracting from photographs in different ways. Like you've created this whole, you created a frame out of the interior of the photograph, if you call this a frame. It is gold too. So there's a kind of wittiness to that possibly. Like I wouldn't call this a frame per se, but you can go there maybe. And the jewelry is a kind of, embodied framing to some degree, that illusion. But there's this kind of scalar transformation on the one hand, and then in the montage or in the twin study, there's a completely other, it's more about the sort of, like what the social historical framing of the photograph itself as a kind of infinite regress. And then the way you're using photography is so fascinating because on the one hand, it's a mnemonic trigger, right? For a story that the viewer may or may not know. But then in the installation, there's both a negative and a magnification. So there's a way in which the photo as an object is completely absented, right? Because you don't really have a print. There's no print anywhere. there's just different states of what the photographic could be. I mean, from my point of view, this idea of many, like a multi-state status of objects is what, what maybe montage would be in the present, and what interests me most as a critic or historian. And it seems like each of you is doing that from a really distinctly different point of view,
I do think there's something about this, like multi-states makes a lot of sense. Christopher, can you hear me? Is this working? It's all right. Sorry.
Are we all cutting?
No, we just lost it. There we go.
Now you fixed me. There we go. No problem.
I don't know, it's like I kind of think of the chair as being it's related to the gold of the reliefs, but it's a different material. And, in terms of the show, I thought, I want everything to be kind of paper and metal, to have a kind of smaller number of materials. But then in reality, they're all extremely different forms of that. Like the newspaper it's not even paper, that's printed. But in terms of the relief sculptures, I was thinking about them as kind of, I wanted them to be the kind of ritual object, to be a kind of jewelry to adorn the space of the exhibition. I was thinking about the exhibition as its own kind of ritual. That's not my analysis. That's sort of like Tino Segal's thing. Says the exhibition is a ritual particular to a kind of neoliberal subject. And I was like, yeah, that seems definitely true. And I wanted to make a ritual object for that. But it wasn't a generic ritual. The ritual for me was sort of like thinking about this wedding that I was surprised by the depth of feeling in it when I kind of saw the images. And I guess there's something about the images and the words both pointing at it, even though what they say don't quite add up. And in your work, Kelly, like thinking about the branches being very close. You said close in geological time. I really love that. And that brings you close in a way that I feel like when I encounter an heirloom, I feel the closeness and the distance always. And the branches, I like how you emphasize. Yeah, it's right there.
It's a little to the side, but since we were talking about the use of gold in the work, and we're talking about fragmentation a little bit, I just wanted to say, like, the way you're talking about gold, you're talking a little bit about it being having qualities that are transformative, but I also love how you displayed it in a way where it's fragmented, because I just love gold so much because of how ductile it is, how it can be reduced to like a bare, to just almost nothing, let's say a liquid, and then be reconstituted. And I feel like there's something very poetic about that in terms of how we're talking about negative space or gaps, or trying to materialize something out of almost nothingness.
I feel like there's a reason, like that, there's a part of why it is this thing that's such a symbol. It's like using all these symbolic and ritualistic objects. And I guess maybe that's kind of like, I don't know, me being a bad historian or anthropologist or something, but it just feels like, yeah, of course, because it's so workable, because it doesn't change, like those qualities are part of it.
And it's a beautiful material to symbolize a kind of union as well, which takes us back to the marriage.
There's a question here too about the role of craft, and I think that's a word that both of you navigate and subject to layers of new density in your work, that you don't treat craft as something in itself, but something that needs to be innervated or volatilized or given new shape over and over again. But thinking about that word, and also the possibility that it would have to be given some kind of other critical agency. I think about this idea that we encounter in Professor Joselit's book, in which we encounter heritage as something that's not simply part of the past, but is constantly renewed in its relationship to the present, or maybe in a state that's equally present and equally past. So the crochet is an example of that, or working with gold at all seems to capture.
But you do it too.
Oh, I'm not.
Don't leave yourself.
No,
those 8x10s.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. Who shoots 8x10?
No, yeah, it is.
And
I'm so happy. I'm very happy to be included in it. No, and I'm not trying to exclude myself for epistemological reasons, more just out of embarrassment of talking about
I
myself.
have to bring you in
Yeah,
because
thank
I'm
you,
like,
please, I'm thrilled to be part of that conversation. But it does. So then I'll say, for us, there is this level of the work that's. I don't know how to think about it exactly. I mean, do we talk about it as that which is about to be lost, or that we wouldn't give up for anything in the world? There's some of that feeling or that pathos that's involved in a manufacture, a handmade thing, or of a technique that isn't supposed to continue in a sense in our era of mass manufacture or of serialized labor, etc. There's some of it. It's about refusing the division of labor, for sure. But there is a way of maybe thinking about this. I guess the question here is there a way of thinking about that, the persistence of working in this way, alongside this concept of heritage? Because if you think about weaving, or working gold, it's something that's very much part of the present. It's not a folksy, old-timey thing in itself, and is also truly ancient. I mean, really right up there against the borders of our oldest artifacts, we could say, are these things, weaving and gold, or the crochet. I know it's not exactly weaving, but kind of not making structures. And so then I suppose it does bring up this question of, if montages are a metaphor for thinking about discontinuity of heritage, maybe there's a way of thinking about craft. And I mean, I don't know why I want to inflect that word with
I understand
hesitance.
what you're saying, but I don't know if anyone else wants to say.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I think, I have, my brain's going in two directions. One is that I think, there does seem to be a lot of interest in craft, and I think, or various kinds of practices that were understood as craft, which already is, taking an expertise and minimizing it to some degree, right? Like, it's not easy to weave or to make glass or to gold leaf. None of these, they're highly skilled activities and or capacities. But part of me thinks that people just don't want to look at screens all the time. That there's a way, that there's a real meaning to choosing to make something in a labor-intensive way. And that, again, I guess I'm just really thinking a lot about how temporalities mean in matter. And that's kind of what I'm trying to think about now. So it's sort of all I'll talk about, whether it's relevant or not. But I think that, you can see when something has taken time, and there's a different texture to it. And it's somewhat ineffable, but I think almost everyone feels it. And I think there's something really meaningful about that. And I also think I think the question of labor is important too. That art is both manual and intellectual labor. And I don't know why, but it does seem like many artists want to insist on that now, in a way that maybe hasn't always been the case. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just like that you brought up screens, because it's not what I was going to think about, but I feel like as you talk about the labor that goes into many handmade objects, you're also talking about the kind of attention they beg for.
Yeah.
And I feel like when you talk about looking at screens, it's a different kind of attention. Exactly. So I'm like, on one hand, there is something about the production, but there's also something about the attention it asks of an audience that I'm just going to say it feels good. You know, it feels good in my brain to like look at something that's been woven or carefully hand drawn, etc. But then I also want to bridge that into like value. And I think for me, when you talk about an interest in craft, I'm just seeing as like one form of value, because, and I'm going to be like a little cynical here, but like if I like, or you or any of us like kind of passively say we're inheriting the kind of art world we've been given, it's kind of like has one very dominant form of value that's being expressed. And I feel like all of us are sort of playing around with searching for different forms of value, and we can't really like rely on, you know, traditional 8x10 photography, because the language of that is like has so much baggage from the past. But I love how you reinvigorate it in the means that you do, but then kind of point back at the value of it in a whole new way. And I feel like you do it similarly in your use of gold leaf, for example.
And I feel like, I remember we talked in, was it 2020? You did the show in New York, and we were talking about, I was hearing you talk about these glass blowers, and I loved what you were saying about craft and thinking about the way knowledge was passed down in these communities, and it was really inspiring to me. And like I was trying to talk to people maybe a year or two after that about how I felt that way about drawing, and people would look at me like, I don't know, like what are you talking about? Like, it's not a craft. And these days I'm really comfortable just like being like, yeah, I think about drawing as something that is absolutely in continuity with people who do it not for art reasons. You know, there are many vernacular reasons people do drawing, and it's like also there are people, it's not even pragmatic, it's just a thing people do, or people who do commercial illustration or courtroom illustration, any of those things. And I think that I guess our conversations around that led me to think about craft as something that really emphasizes continuity, like knowledge being passed down, comfort with extending tradition and building on it. And I think it sort of goes a little bit back to like that, for me, like versus like ripping something from its context. And I think about, I don't know, in one story of the avant-garde as being about like ruptures and discontinuity. And I think that thinking about craft as a way to think about connections is kind of powerful. And I think that is also part of one version of what is powerful about, you know, an inheritance. And I think the reason I like the word heritability, which is like I guess it's a less commonly used word, you know, and it's more in the scientific context, is it just thinks about like what is the nature of that connection? Like how do we take things from one place to another? How do things get reproduced? And there are a lot of different stories of how that can be. Yeah, I don't know if any of that resonates with you, but it. Do you think, should we open up for a few questions from the audience? I don't know.
Questions for our panelists, for the artists, or our valued visitors here?
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much. I get so much out of all of your practices. This is kind of like a question from your dad, but including you, David, what surprised you all most in the work that you spoke about today in the process of making?
Should I start? Well, I'll just say what surprises me about David's work, since I don't make that kind of work. I think his globe heads, you know, he used to make cartoons, right? I don't know if all of you know that. Was it the Yale Daily News?
Yeah, 3 times a week.
Yeah. And so I think there's something about having a language, you know, that you develop a serial language that moves through time, that continues from one iteration to another, that is a kind of craft of a different sort. It's not always about the rendering itself, but also how you can sustain a narrative. And so I think this character of the globe head, you know, I've seen them in David's drawings now for, I mean, how many years? I don't know how many years you've been doing them, but I feel like I've seen them over quite a while, and they continue to seem mystifying to me. Like, I don't feel like I have a, soundbite that I can apply to it, which makes me a little teeny bit uncomfortable, but also that's usually the sign that something interesting is happening. So.
Oh, that's great. I'll talk about one thing in Jeffrey's pieces that I was really surprised and learned about, and it'll go sideways into something that I guess it was just, the way that I loved the way you talked about some of the basis of the caterpillar image in terms of its or place in the world, in terms of its cultural significance, but you really brought it into talking about your life just, I don't know, an hour ago, in a way that I don't think I had heard you talk about your work in those personal, straightforward terms, and I really loved hearing that. And I think being able to talk about things from one register to the other is really powerful. I mean, I see that in your work too, to talk about your family experience and geological time in the same work is incredible. And I love that he used the word scalar, which, I love that word too, but thinking about moving between these different scales, and like when I made this exhibition and it was so much about my family, I also wanted it to be, and I started with a feeling. I was missing my grandmother. That's when I did the Google search. And I also wanted to think about things that were very distant, like the way that heritage functions outside of my family and the culture, and like moving between near and far, I think is something, I don't know, I was surprised by how much that came up and made me really happy.
The way you were just talking about searching for your grandmother in Google somehow took me back to Camera Lucida a little bit. It's just a nice moment, which I did, and it's not from today because we talked at your opening about the work, and we've talked since then about the work. But when we talked about this piece, it didn't come up today because I don't know how to really talk about it, but it's just the feeling of when you're trying to search for something and you realize, your grandmother's name, your father's name, your great-grandparents' name is like the key word to unlocking something from the past. I don't know how to describe it better, but there's something very mysterious and meaningful, and also you just don't know what to do with it at the same time. It's kind of like, oh, this feels powerful, but why? I don't know how to describe it. It's very difficult, but when you talked with me about this and I came to understand that's how this article was unlocked for you and the image was unlocked for you. I wish there was another way to talk about it. Maybe that's just the way to leave it for now, is that indescribable feeling of having access through something so personal.
That's great.
That's really beautiful to think about. It makes me think then, we're in a country of lost names because of the forces of assimilation. Outright racism, the way that the epidermis was somehow used as a metric of various social hierarchies. But then maybe also for fun, reinvention, to the idea that the name would have been lost as a precondition of entering Ellis Island or assimilating later. That's really interesting. And to find them isn't simply good or straightforward too. I suppose that leads me to this thing that I'm shocked by from the minute I heard about this work from you, David. The way that you navigate what Professor Joselit was referring to as the dispossession of identity or heritage, the way that something avowedly negative, the spectacle of alterity, this kind of newspaperly otherness that your family history was reduced to, which became the way that you found out about your family history, so then became an opportunity, became this place of possibility that you then subjected to erasure, deletion, revision, cutting out the central elements, the most salacious bits that are being described in the captions. So the surprise for me was this dance between the positive presentation of story the negative encounter with past time and media that brought about for you, the use of that moment of alienation to produce something else, to not fill in the gap, but make this other scene with the globe heads. And it seems to me the more that we look at the work, the less certain which element, which value, positive or negative, which one has. So we don't have, of course, a new spectacle of alterity here. The center is very meaningfully absent in that way. We don't have something that's just knee-jerkedly anti-identitarian in the sense that someone will say, I hate identity art or something like that. It's not that. It's very uncomfortably not self-congratulatory against the thing that it's naming. It's also not looking to be simply included or accepted as, as a family history previously written out of history. And the way it navigates those things is, it continues to surprise me each time I'm in this space. It's not just the concept of it or a methodology that you've come up with, but a way of navigating the past that I think is very valuable and understudied, not part of an existing canon or even genealogy. I mean, there's a few artists I think we could start to look at along those lines, but for me that's very surprising.
That's you.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so I have two totally different kinds of questions. And then I also feel rude, like maybe Grant to joke, but because I have to run in a minute to get my own children, so it's not that I don't like what you said. I'm running out after this. Okay, so the first question is one maybe about terms and the kind of slippage between inheritance, heritage, heritability. So I would love to hear each of you kind of say which of these terms you find your work or your thinking is motivating or is being motivated by. And I think there are different theoretical touchstones, and I'm just curious kind of where people are with that. But the other kind of question really goes back to, Kelly, your materiality points, which I love. And thinking about so much of the conversation kind of going around ideas of time and temporality, but not so much the kind of, like back to that physical layering of materials and kind of what is actually supporting what, and kind of how heavy or light these different materials are. And I was thinking, with the shows that you were showing, I don't know what you call it, the effigy or the work that you didn't show, but in the first show it was stone, and then you had the flowers kind of sprinkled, and then in the garden the kind of weight of the metal, but then the flowers coming through. And so very different ideas of kind of what is being layered down, or like what is supporting what, and the kind of physical conjunctions there seem like they're also metaphorically or philosophically and ethically doing very different kinds of work. And then, David, when you were showing me how light these things are, and like not throwing them around, but I was surprised because they have this illusion of not just like depth or puncturing something, but the way they rest on the plane of the wall. You described it like jewelry in relation to the jewelry, but also like an earring or some kind of adornment, but that is actually like wafer thin and really light. And so just thinking about also the kind of valences of heaviness or heft versus lightness, and then kind of what is actually, but also kind of illusionistically or metaphorically, like doing what kind of work with those relative weights. So whatever people want to, sorry, that was a lot and totally different kinds of things.
Great. Do you want to start with the materiality?
I thought you would start.
All right, I'll do it. I'll do it. Well, it is true. It's like the lightness of it was really important. Like when the idea came, it was like I knew I wanted it to be relief sculpture. I knew I wanted to feel like my mother's wedding jewelry that I had earlier memories of, just seeing like its extreme chunkiness, and her talking about like how it was kind of gaudy and that she liked that, and that has been Golly woman. She was into the big gaudiness, and then seeing it on her counter upside down and being like, wait, this is actually so thin. There's like nothing there. And I felt like the sculpture had to have that quality. And I spent a long time trying to figure out what it would be. Like I considered other materials that had much less touch, and I really, I settled on this cast paper because it allowed me to pull from a little bit of techniques similar to chasing and repoussé without the time frame of mastery that would be required to have a sense of touch and improvisation. Like, to really learn how to work metal in that way, I thought would take longer than I could. But like I could work with clay, which would, in chasing and repoussé, you have this warmed pitch underneath the metal that you hammer into. And the clay that was underneath the photograph that I would then kind of draw on top of, push and work, it was very similar to that. And then the paper had its own touch, and it did start to feel like jewelry in that way. And it was very funny seeing it go up and suddenly move from being something where like it felt weightless to feeling very heavy. And really the verticality kind of did that, which is kind of like when the jewelry is being worn and it feels really heavy.
So I'll somehow bring both your questions into one answer. And it's funny because your first question, I really am feeling very self-conscious answering it, because inheritance has always been my word of choice. And as you asked it, I'm like, oh, there's really this passive acceptance that I'm like subject to all this baggage, let's say, and trying to sort through it somehow. And for some reason, I guess I've always taken it as a way to empathetically connect with other people in the world today and how we kind of manage our existence. So I'm having an existential crisis now on stage. But separately from that, as you talked about materials, I really thought through it for a moment, and I thought about force as a way that I want to answer it. I'm thinking not only about the weight of different materials, but the density of them, which often implies a weight. But I guess I'm just thinking about the materials you brought up, which is the bronze and the stone, as the denser materials, and then the plants, let's say, some are living, some are decaying. They have different kinds of temporalities and different kinds of states of existence. But those are sort of the surrender of the work. So maybe instead of thinking about the weight of both of them, I'm thinking about the kind of force or surrender that's applied to each. One being very sculpted and a lot of force being applied to the bronze and stone elements, but then the plants, a sort of instigation happening to the plants that are living or the plants that have been disarranged on the marble, and then a surrender to let them sort of do their thing, and entropy. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought this up, because for me, the term that I've used is heritage, and I tried to define it earlier. I think it's often a commodity, and inheritance, I would say, is almost the raw material of that. But heritability is a new one for me, and it's interesting, and I've been thinking about it, especially in response to your question, and it does seem to be, there's the Darwinian side of it, but then there's the idea of who does inherit? So it's really quite different. It's about claim making, privilege, maybe dispossession. It's the kind of heritage in action. So I think it's a really interesting term that I personally have not thought through, but now, kind of want to more.
I think the reason I really have been using the term heritability and kind of, wanted to bring us together under that word was mainly not because it is, better than the other versions. As a matter of fact, inheritance, just hearing you talk, it makes me, I really connect to a lot of human experiences through that word in a different way. But I think I've seen more discourse around inheritance, or really great articulations of heritage in terms of commodities. And I thought heritability, it really mostly has been in a scientific context that people use it. And the reason, part of the reason I put Galton in the text that was for this is because I wanted to think about how that scientific context connects to the economic context, and that also speaks to the human context. Like, it's like Galton wanted to study difference because he really wanted to prove that he was best, because he was a child prodigy. And then turns out when you're a child prodigy and then you grow up, other adults are also smart and you're less special. Like, there's this like very psychological, personal bent to his research. And, you know, he's writing to his cousin Darwin and talking about this. And I didn't want to veer us super far off track to some of my more esoteric interests, but I think heritability and thinking about the connection between the scientific way of thinking about it and these non-scientific ones are really powerful. And, like, I guess the person I didn't talk about earlier, I'll just mention very briefly, is I think Octavia Butler's really interesting. For this, the Xenogenesis trilogy, which has been, you know, pretty widely written about, which is why I didn't talk about it earlier. But the idea of kind of 3-part parentage instead of 2, and and its relationship to hierarchical thinking is a main theme of that work. And thinking about fiction and science and dissent all together, you know, it's great. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. Jeffrey, you mentioned like in an essay like 8 years ago about David's highlighter ingots, and you mentioned this thing about I've always pronounced this word wrong because I heard about the word way in my childhood, but the daemon or the demon of how things sort of operate within, like, say, like, in the computer world, it's like a software thingy that's meant to assist or provision assistance towards this achievement of, like, a goal or something. And I was wondering, like, where all of you sort of position yourself within this idea of, like, the assistance towards, like, achieving towards the hand of, like, I'm sorry for cooking this, but like where the demon or the spirit is supposed to sort of be in relation to the ultimate, like, provision of presenting the work in the end, like, in terms of the visibility of, you know, I mean, you mentioned craft, Kelly, and I was wondering, like, where that, like, demon is sort of, like, reaching for. I don't know.
We were talking over these past months about but we're using this metaphor of sickness or evil or fever from this word mal in French, which is appended to archive in this famous text about, well, I guess a lot of things, but on the face of it, on archive and dealing with the past and the way in which they have their own spirits or daemons or unconsciouses, etc. And so we talked a lot about, in your relationship to your work, this archive fever or this archive illness or this museum sickness or this evil of the archive, etc., however we want to translate that, and this kind of sinister persistence of the past through, I mean, whatever we want to call them, these alienated means. It's a local newspaper archive, which didn't mean harm as such. It didn't set out to do bad, but that was an alienating experience for you to go into this archive and to encounter these things. And what you've done, the revisions and excisions that you've conducted on the newsprint is in some sense a way of, I think, dealing with this kind of, whatever we want to call this strange agency of the past coming into the present. I'd be more interested in hearing what you think about it.
Well, I mean, I guess it's hard for me, probably just because of the title, Scalar Demon. I'm like thinking about, you know, why I chose that name for that exhibition. It was a show at Reserve Ames almost, I guess about 8 years ago now, maybe 9. And I guess was thinking about the feeling of, you know, when you send an email out and you get the email back right away, there's that ping and your attention's hit, and there's a kind of activation that you feel alive. But also, if it comes too fast, you may, even before you open it, you maybe know that it's the automated response. And so that's, I think, thinking about that feeling, I don't know, thinking about when you feel alive or when you feel dead in these kinds of external experiences is important. And I think there could be a whole lot more said about, like, in the archive, what feels kind of vital or not. And there's a lot of language about whether things are being reanimated or not that we could talk about, but it's maybe another conversation. Another person I didn't talk about a lot, but could have, was Saidiya Hartman, and I had her book Wayward Lives, in which she talks about, she uses a lot of language about reanimation to write a second-person narrative from the point of view of people whose lives have been largely excised from the archive. And it's just like it's all you. It's you, and then she's writing from the point of view of these people. And I think to me, that feels like the kind of demon.
I don't want to add. I like what you said. It's like
Thanks for the question. Yeah, Grant.
Hi, thanks to the other questions in the absence of Suzanne, because I was sort of like, I don't feel like looking at and I was like, I don't have a question, I don't know what to really say. But I think I sort of found it, and I'll try to be very simple. Craft, like polemically, craft is not conceptual. You know, that we can disagree or agree with that, but, you know, a carpet doesn't come with a press release. And so the question could stop there. Right? This has been a very intelligent, thoughtful talk, but like the inherent tension of craft, in its like most stereotypical, imagined binary way, is like the ball gown doesn't have big ideas. It's a ball gown.
Well, that's funny for you to say as a historian of fashion.
Oh yeah, throw it under the bus.
Yeah. Who wants to take it?
I think suddenly of that wonderful line from Walter Benjamin as he's writing on the concept of history, and he says, "For it is the eternal, which is more on the frill of a dress than any big idea." So I think the argument would be made quite to the contrary. I don't know if I can't speak for everyone, but I think the argument can be made that while not a theoretical discourse authored by a single agent, each one of these practices, weaving, since you bring it up, you know, carpets, working in gold of different kinds, that they are themselves the result, they're the object and a cause of a discourse. They're a nodal point, an actant, if you will, among many things, including discourses, which are inscribed upon them. Think of the know-how of weaving. How do you get taught it? I mean, textile manufacture is a wonderful example because it produces computer programming discourses. All of computer programming comes through a history of weaving and precisely making rugs and carpets. So we wouldn't have systems theory, a very theoretical discourse, had it not been for weaving. So in some sense, I suppose I would argue that the challenge of someone like David or Kelly's work is this insistence that while they're not interested in giving a theoretical disquisition by casting the hand, they would acknowledge the continuity of that craft practice, pardon the extreme abbreviation of the practice, but a practice that's laden with craft precisely in a set of literatures and discourses, verbal and archival and everything else. This is also, I mean, part of what for me was the surprise of David Muenzer's work is encountering a manifestly discursive practice, this work with the newspaper, which I know how to read from media theory and I know how to read from contemporary art history. I know more or less what to do with those gestures. But next to the couch, which is essentially a giant piece of bridal jewelry, Bengali bridal jewelry, that's where the challenge comes, is seeing the inscription on the couch as continuous with one in the newspaper. That's my take, though I love the provocation. It does seem like an exciting one.
Well, modern art has always taken up obsolete zones. So, I agree with Jeffrey that craft, what we call craft, has a ton of advanced knowledge embedded in it, which may now be superseded depending on what that craft is by other kinds of practices, but nonetheless initially did. But I think in some ways the answer to your question is that it's a zone that hasn't been overcoded to a certain degree and that is available for recoding. And you guys might disagree with that, but I think that even conceptual artists had a certain kind of craft skill, which would be, calling up, fabricators or maybe that's not a craft, but their skills always backing up anything conceptual. So, but it's an interesting provocation.
Yeah, I'm dealing in false binaries.
There's a question.
Oh yeah.
Well, I just have a small point on the craft thing, which is that, Kelly, I liked your example of the crochet blanket that is always passed down, because I think no one would want to be so rude as to throw out something that always a woman has spent a lot of time making. But I actually just wanted to say something about how this couch really makes me think we're leaving a manuscript, and how you've kind of turned the absence of your grandparents into your own inscriptions in this really beautiful way. So I just wanted to bring in something even older, and I know Jeffrey's been doing a lot of manuscripts that are kind of fragmented in this way. So I just thought that example of the archive was something I wanted to mention.
I definitely relate to that. And like
the gold too.
The
is,
gold, yeah.
Often used to illuminate the manuscripts.
And it kind of, I don't know about them in the way that you do. I have a really non-scholarly knowledge of them, but when I look at them, I see attention, time, faith, in the acts of, what we call illumination, and I think I'm definitely interested in those things. It's definitely in that, and it is probably to some extent in when I'm making a drawing too. I usually talk about the drawings as something passing through my body, and I think that is more aligned with the medieval way of producing an image than something later, at least in the West. Yeah.
Any final thoughts or questions? All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.